but not by name because I was going to.
So sorry.
I know.
So sorry.
I know.
Wanted to stop.
I know, and Dion and
Jeff?
both
Good.
reached out.
Good, I'm
Thank
glad.
you.
I'm glad. The boys, I think I met them once before.
They're a little bit bigger.
You're Fritz?
I'm
Oh, you
Fritz.
didn't?
No, I didn't know you're
Hi, honey. I'm so sorry.
It's been a while since I was in Soulsbury, I think we
I
met.
would not.
So hot.
No? I think I met one of you.
I know.
Okay.
I mean, no words. I mean,
Sorry, Barbara.
really heartfelt messages from
Yeah. I'm
no
working.
memories.
Took a little bit.
You're alive.
I know.
I'm so sorry.
That's what we heard.
I'm bummed that I canceled it.
Hello, I came in the back way. I know.
Oh, yeah, good. We'll do
But
that.
for a reason.
Good.
These are my boys. They know my boys. Hey, bless your heart. Oh. Hi, I'm very sorry too.
Yes, we met.
That's why we it was a really tough year. She's been ready. She survived the pandemic, but after the pandemic, it was the combination of isolation and her needs and her age. Remember John?
Yes, thank you. Oh, thanks for coming.
Getting ready. I'm going to take your seats. This is my associate, Jay Goldfarb. Jay's going to take you to the cemetery. I'm meeting another family. So I just wanted to introduce you. So
Thank you.
he'll be taking over from here.
Okay. Thank you. That's right. My father's funeral. Thank you.
Somebody who knows what she did. So yeah.
We'll begin with some words from King Solomon eulogizing his mother in the words of Eishes Chayil. Eishes Chayil mi yimtza v'rachok mipnini michra botach bo lev ba'ala v'shalal lo yechsor gumalasu tov v'lo kol yimei chayeha darsha tzemer ufishtim v'tas b'chefetz kapeha. A gallant woman who can find. Far beyond pearls is her worth. Her husband's heartfelt trust is in her, and he shall lack for nothing. She bestows good upon him and never harm all the days of her life. She seeks out wool and linen, and her hands work willingly. Kamu baneha vayashruha bala vayihalala, rabos banos osochayil vatalis al kulana, sheker hachein vehevel hayofi, isha yiras Adonai hisis halal, tnu lami priyadeha vihalaluha v'sha'orim ma'aseha. Her children arise and praise her husband, and he lauds her. Many daughters have accomplished well, but you surpass them all. Grace is false and beauty is vain. A woman in awe of the Lord, she should be praised. Give her the fruits of her own hand, and let her deeds praise her in the gathering places. And we are gathered here now to say our farewell to Rose Nagler, Shoshana Bas Abram Vitzila. I merited to get to know Rose quite well my first years here in Cleveland, where she was very much a regular at Heights Jewish Center. I saw her every week. She would sit together with her close friend Rita Kaur. She'd live and be well. And I got to speak with her on a weekly basis on pretty much every Shabbos after Kiddush. We would talk about, she'd listen to my sermon, we would talk about it, talk about life. It was a pleasure, truly a pleasure, to have gotten to know her. She shared with me when she was sitting Shiva for her husband some of the absolutely fascinating, tragic but still fascinating details of a very rich life which made it past the age of 90. This is a story that I feel should not only be told now at her funeral, but I would encourage Abby and I would encourage Rose's grandsons to make a point of continuing to share the story, not only during Shiva, but in the months and years to come, because this is a story of a generation that is coming to a close now, and the world should know about it. Not only the family and the friends that are here now, but I think generations to come should become familiar with what was truly a fascinating life in a fascinating and tragic time. I have more to say, but right now I'd like to call upon my grandson to share some thoughts with us.
To me and my brother Ted, our grandmother Rose was simply Bubby, meaning grandmother in Yiddish. She was the grandparent with whom we were closest, since our grandfather kept largely to himself, and our father's parents died very young, long before we could get to know them. Although Bubby was too modest to admit it, she lived through and accomplished a lot in her lifetime of just over 90 years. I would even argue that she epitomizes a version of her generation's American dream, one rooted not in fame and fortune, but rather independence and self-worth. She came to this country after hiding from the worst of World War II and the Holocaust, and took the opportunity to find an occupation, raise and provide for a family, and learn to enjoy the little things life has to offer, like knitting, classical music, and a good babka. And she did all of it in the humblest way possible, choosing to never draw attention to herself or take any part of her life for granted. In fact, Bubby was so modest that I'm quite sure she'd have preferred to have only the rabbi speak at her funeral. But I'd be remiss if I didn't take the chance to honor her life and share with you a few favorite memories and personality traits. So much of Bubby's life revolved around food, and she could always be found in the kitchen. During my childhood, one of the best parts of the week was going to Bubby's house for Shabbat lunch, where we worshipped her signature spread of cholent, latkes, and noodlekugel. If there was a holiday, you could count on Bubby to prepare something for it. For Shabbat, challah. Hanukkah, sufganiyot. Thanksgiving, pumpkin pie with rum. She hosted both Thanksgiving and Passover, regardless of whether the crowd was large or small. She kept a stash of onion cookies, mundel bread, and Russian tea biscuits in jars on her counter at all times, and sour candies and caramels in her purse for emergency purposes. And let's not forget her babka. The poor man's version, as she called it, since it was just challah dough with a cinnamon sugar swirl, which she would regularly deliver each time she visited. I think food may have meant so much to Bubby because of her experience in hiding during the Holocaust, when she had to live on what was available. Later in life, it became the only thing she wouldn't deny herself. She inhaled ice cream cones. And when I was done scraping the pulp from a sliced grapefruit, she would point out all the spots I had missed. One of my most cherished and most recent memories with Bubby revolves around food as well, when I spent a day making bagels with her on a holiday break. I still make them today, and their taste always transports me back to that afternoon. If I had to pick one word to describe Bubby, I would use this one: unconventional. Bubby was not your typical grandparent who would take you to baseball games and brunch. She would take me to the library for story time and chase me up and down the aisles when I could no longer sit still, or so I'm told. She was a formidable opponent at ping pong. Put a paddle in the lady's hand and she would make you look weak. As hard as I've tried to remember a time when I actually beat her at the game, I don't think such a miracle ever happened. Once at my elementary school's fundraiser, she and I agreed on a time and place to meet. But rather than patiently wait for me, she went to the DJ and asked them to announce my name so everyone could hear. Not the most conventional way to find your grandson, but it was certainly effective. Most iconic, however, is that Ted and I have Bubby to thank for convincing our parents to let us watch The Simpsons long before it was age appropriate. Of course, they were not thrilled, but after Bubby, me, and Ted once accidentally watched an episode together and burst out laughing, my parents couldn't say no. Bubby was always up to date on current affairs, and she marveled when new details were revealed about history. When she picked me up from school on Friday afternoons, I knew I'd be greeted by the voices of her best friends at NPR. If dinner was at her house, she'd turn on the world news without fail, and after it was over, she'd spend much of the conversation giving her opinion on the current state of the world. Whenever something particularly interesting or upsetting occurred, she would say something like, "I'm not going to be here to see what happens next, but your generation is going to have to figure it out. And when you do, write me a letter and tell me how you did it." Bubby decorated her refrigerator primarily with funny quotes, like, "I know it's a good day because only everything hurts." But she made an exception for photos too, provided they were meaningful. There's one I'd like to mention of me, her, and my mom in Israel when they visited me on my college study abroad in Jerusalem. Of course, the photo was meaningful to her because she lived through the Holocaust to meet her daughter and grandson in the Holy Land. But to me, it's significant simply because it's the best trip I've ever taken with her. I remember that at the time, I naively complained to my mom about us walking too slowly. But now I look back and recognize how impressive it was for her to keep up at 80 years old. I do remember one particular night when we couldn't hail any taxis, so I put the two of them on a bus back to their hotel, showing my mom how to follow the route on Google Maps, and praying for the best. When I asked the driver to watch over them and direct them when to get off, they laughed in my face. And then I said, "Will you please do it for my grandmother?" And the driver promised they'd be okay. Bubby, I want you to know how much you meant to us, not only to me, but to everyone here. Thank you for teaching us what it means to live a life that is unassuming but purposeful, rooted in kindness, and filled with the indulgence of simple pleasures. I promise to one day write you a letter should I ever find the answers to life's questions myself. May you rest in peace.
So first, I don't usually do this, but I find that many of the details are so fascinating that for posterity they should be known. Just a number of the biographical details of Rose. Rose was, as was mentioned, 90 years old, which means, if you do the math, she was born in 1933, which means that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, she was only 8 years old. 7, 8 years old. And the way that she lived through the Holocaust was by first escaping the immediate area where they were. She's from Lvov, which was, depending on what year you're in, Galicia, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, Soviet Union, all these places. Her father was killed rather early in the war, and she and her mother survived by being hidden away by a non-Jewish man, a man by the name of Simon Yurenko. And this is where they remained for the duration of Yurenko. This is where they remained for the duration of the war. He was involved as a tailor. This is where Rose learned how to sew and all of her various tailoring skills, which she passed on at least the awareness of to Abby, came from this time, and they were entirely hidden in this small space for the remaining years of the war, basically from 42 through till 45. What happened afterwards, even though we all generally think of the war as being over in 45 and then life is back to normal, life was not at all back to normal for her or her mother. Her mother managed to remarry after the war, and then had another child after the war as well with her new husband. Rose was a teenager by that point, and they made the rather difficult decision. I remember when Rose told me the story herself, she was a little embarrassed at how this might sound to the modern ear, but they were dealing in the late 40s with an entirely uncertain future. They didn't know where they would end up. They knew that going back to Lvov was simply not a realistic option. So the question is, where are you going to go? And an opportunity was there for her to head to Canada. However, and she told me this, I remember her apologizing several times to me as she was telling me this. The only way that the availability of going there would be possible, or at least as certain as possible, is if she would claim to be orphaned of both parents, meaning she had to go as an orphan. That's who they were allowing in. And she and her mother agreed to do this. She is a teenager, that she had to claim that not only that her father had died, but that her mother had died as well. And with this arrangement, she ended up in Toronto, and already, right now we're talking 49, 1950. And then she spent those years, and she knew her mother was alive, and her mother and her stepfather then made it to New York City. But while they were there, she was being raised by a wonderful family that the family maintains a strong connection to this day, basically seeing themselves as siblings that took very good care of her. There was a Mrs. Atkin, her daughter, the Brown family, and they took care of them in Toronto, and they raised her, even though she was already a teenager, they raised her as one of their own, something which unfortunately didn't always happen. But with her, it did happen, and they treated her very well. She was eventually reunited with her mother after a few years, and when she went to the United States, and she was reunited with her mother, and then remained and helped out with the family until she herself got married in 1960. this is the piece that I feel is, there are pieces of this that are simply not appreciated, and that I feel, and I've shared this story, by the way, with others, even not mentioning, even people who don't know Rose, but meaning just it's a piece of the history of our people that I think is important to be mentioned, what it is that the Holocaust and war, and not only the Holocaust, but the way I see it, and the way I think we should all see it, there's a Holocaust, but there's also the post-Holocaust world, which had its own series of tragedies in the DP camps and after the DP camps, and figuring out how to reestablish one's life, that I think these stories have to be shared. After she married, after a few years, Abby came, and Rose had a quality about her that I think in the modern brain science lingo could only be described as being both left-brained and right-brained. And if you think about it, meaning she was educated and she was a quality, intelligent, widely admired bookkeeper, which means all the math parts of her brain were all fired up, meaning the kind of education that was possible. If you work out the years, you realize where she was at the time that she would have been, that another person her age would be busy with high school and college and things like that. Those things were not really available or possible for her. So while all of those parts of that part of the brain with the math and the bookkeeping were there, she also showed a skill that was mentioned briefly, which is the skill of using her hands, so that she was not just an accomplished tailor of sorts, an accomplished baker. She also had the accomplishment of having a green thumb, Abby told me. So to be both someone skilled in mathematics and having a green thumb is a rarity, I think, in many parts of the world. The fact that she had this intelligence and independence and skill in both of these areas is something that should be mentioned. With all of this, I can testify, and I saw this on a weekly basis, and when I commented that I found that that Ben had this skill as well, she was in full agreement. She had a Yiddish tam, very much a Yiddish tam about her. What's that Yiddish tam? Yiddish means Jewish. Tam means taste. Doesn't quite, translate very well. But a style of life that was distinctly Jewish and proud to be Jewish and loved being Jewish, and that just exuded from her. And it's something that she knew she had. It just came naturally to her. And it's, I think, why I enjoyed seeing her in shul, because it was that flavor, maybe that's a good word, of a time, a few generations ago, where it didn't matter what you said. It just had, meaning it had some kind of Jewish cultural resonance, if you will, so that no matter what she said, it had that Yiddish flavor and joie de vivre that I so admired about her. And this includes, and this is something that I saw at shul, which was very precious for me to witness, were the friendships that she had there with the regulars here in our shul. I would often see her sitting with Rita Kaur, as I mentioned, but as Abby told me, and I think I knew, although I didn't know the full extent of it until Abby told me, that she had relationships with the other, main families, if you will, at the shul. So there were the Mailses and the Hoffers and the Geduls, and the ability, not the ability, but rather the fact that they, as was mentioned, shared Thanksgiving and Pesach Seders and these things together, and it created this community, this bond of families that was so precious for me to witness. I think that if there are ways, obviously we have no interest in needing to replicate the Mesiras Nefesh, meaning the self-sacrifice that she had to go through in her youngest years before she was 10 years old, knowing what it was like to have to avoid death on a daily basis, and then to suffer in one's teens through the difficulty of not knowing any place that you can call home. Meaning, think about it. She was already at the age of 8. She's put in a situation where her life is in peril every minute of the day. And then at the age of 13, until through her teenage years, she has no place that she can legitimately call home. This is where I live. This is my family. All of that is in flux. And yet, so when people wonder, how is it that a person becomes feisty? We understand that if to call someone feisty nowadays, you say, wow, that's a trip. They have a real personality. But this was born of necessity. Because how else do you go on unless you have that kind of fortitude? And this is the fortitude that Rose possessed in abundance, that everyone who knew her got to see her, and is really, in a grandiose way, I could call it the secret to Jewish survival, but I don't mean that in a grandiose way. I mean that in quite just a literal, factual way, that the way that she went about her life is quite literally, has always been for thousands of years, the secret to Jewish survival. And that, but done without any of that grandiosity. It was simply just the way that she was, the way that she had to be when she was younger, and therefore she continued to be and to have that strong character even in her later years. And it's something that I admired very much in her. And then she took that still with a sense of gratitude. So that Abby mentioned the last few years, which were more difficult as signs of dementia set in, and all of a sudden she went from being a homeowner, having her own home in University Heights, to be in that position of dependence, where she was at where there was the Myers Apartments, or later Stone Gardens, and she had very much an attitude of gratitude to the family, gratitude to the people who took care of her at Myers, and then later at Stone Gardens. Abby asked me to mention the gratitude for the people who in the last few months really did everything they could and went above and beyond to show her so much love and care. Schiffer Rennert and the entire team of people that were so kind and so caring and considerate. And I think that's important to mention now because she felt that gratitude and the family does as well. A number of the milestones of Rose's life took place in the month of March. And so just interesting that here we are at the very beginning of the month of March, how she also passed away. I think that it's now up to the rest of us, not just her daughter, her grandsons, but those of us who knew her, who should now make a point of trying to figure out how to take those gifts that she had and incorporate those gifts into our own lives to figure out how we can develop that kind of strength, that kind of resilience, feistiness, to continue at a time where the Jewish people right now find themselves in other forms of existential danger from the ones that were fought 80 years ago, but still can be seen either as a burden or, in addition to being a burden, also to be seen as an opportunity to develop a new form of resilience and strength and feistiness to do what is necessary for the Jewish people to live. I would love to write Rose a letter very soon, letting her know how the Jewish people overcome the current difficulties that we have been in over the course of the last 4 or 5 months. I would like to write that letter very soon. And I think that in that letter, when we describe what it is that we were able to do to get through this, we will say, the Jewish people used some of those skills that you yourself employed in your own life to get through your own difficulties. Yizichar Baruch, may her memory be a blessing. Everyone will rise for the memorial prayer. El Malei Rachamim Shochein b'meromim Hamitzei menucha nechona Al kanfei ha-Shekhinah B'malos kedoshim v'taharim Kizar harakia mazhirim Es nishmas Shoshana bas Avram Shalachal olamah Ba'avur shanachnu mispalalim Bad hazkoras nishmasa Began Eden tehei menuchasa Lachein ba'al orachamim Yasira V'seiser knafav le'olamim Vitzror achayim es nishmasa Adonai hu nachalasa V'sanuach b'shalom al mishkava V'nomar amen. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant proper repose on the sheltering wings of your presence, and the lofty levels of the holy and pure who shine as the brightness of the heavens, unto the soul of Rose Nagler, Shoshana bas Avram, who has gone to her world and for whose memory we pray. May her rest be in paradise. May the Master of Compassion bring her under the cover of his wings, and bind her soul in the bond of life. May the Lord be her heritage, and may she repose on her resting place in peace. And let us respond, Amen. We'll now be headed. The burial will take place at Sinai Cemetery on Some Center Road. Abby will be sitting Shiva at Acacia on the Green, 2202 Acacia Park Drive, Unit 601. The visiting hours for tonight, today after the burial until 8 p.m., Tuesday through Thursday, 2 to 5 and then 7 to 9, and then Friday, 2 to 4 p.m. Donations can be made either to JFS, JFSA, the Kol Israel Foundation, or Heights Jewish Center. If there's anyone who are serving as pallbearers, if they've come.
Yes, pallbearers to step forward, please. Any gentlemen going to the cemetery could act as pallbearers. Pallbearers, if you'll go to the Seco, please. Follow me, please. We'll conclude services here at the chapel. Friends may exit to the car. If you are driving to the cemetery, we ask that you start your car, put on your headlights and your flashers. Thank you. I like your glasses.
Similar, yeah. Okay, so there's time in between when we get Passover starts. Okay. All right.
We're back on the 11th.
Yeah, so there's like the 22nd. Yeah. Yes, we got a little time.
Good seeing you.
Say hi to Daryl. How's he doing?
Oh, he's fine.
Isn't that great?
Yeah,
Modern medical
he's normal,
miracle.
healthy.
That's crazy.
Yeah, yesterday
Given
we
all
did
the-
yard work and we went out to dinner Saturday. Yeah, he's like normal. He's trying to go back to work.
That's great.